A tiny object carved into stone thousands of years ago has quietly become one of the most argued about shapes in all of ancient art, and almost nobody agrees on what it actually is. It looks like a handbag, a small rectangular bag with a curved handle gripped by the same kind of figure, carried the same way, carved by people who lived thousands of miles and thousands of years apart. You can find it in the oldest temple ever discovered in Turkey. You can find it on the walls of Assyrian palaces in Iraq. You can find it in carvings from ancient Mexico. And for decades, this single repeating shape has fueled one of the internet's favorite ancient mysteries, the claim that it proves lost contact between ancient civilizations. Or worse, that it proves visitors from beyond this planet once walked among us. Here is what the object actually is, why it keeps showing up across so many cultures, and why the more dramatic explanation falls apart the moment you look closely at the evidence. Let's start where the story always starts, in ancient Mesopotamia, the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that historians consider the cradle of urban civilization. Roughly 5,000 years ago, the Sumerians living there did something no one on Earth had done before. They developed the first true writing system, pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay to keep records, tell stories, and pass down laws. They built some of the first true cities. They divided time into hours, minutes, and seconds in ways that still shape how we measure the day. None of this needs exaggeration to sound impressive. It genuinely was the beginning of much of what we now call civilization. And it is in the art of this civilization, and the Assyrian Empire that followed centuries later, that the small bag-shaped object appears again and again, held by figures who are clearly meant to represent something more than ordinary people. These figures tower over the humans carved beside them. Many wear tall, horned headdresses, a symbol Mesopotamian artists reserved specifically for divine or semi-divine beings. Some have wings, and in one hand, usually held down at the side, is that same small rectangular shape with a curved handle. In the other hand, many of these figures hold a small cone-shaped object, which they appear to be dipping toward a stylized tree. One of the earliest and most famous individual Mesopotamian images connected to this broader tradition is a plaque known today as the Berni relief, generally dated to somewhere around the early 2nd millennium BCE, showing a winged goddess figure standing between two owls, her feet rendered as the talons of a bird of prey. Scholars have debated for a century exactly which goddess this plaque represents, and precisely what she is holding, and that ongoing academic debate is itself a useful reminder of just how much careful, contested, evidence-based discussion genuinely surrounds this material within mainstream scholarship, long before any of it reaches viral video territory. The bucket and cone imagery specifically becomes far more standardized and far more common a little later, especially once you reach the height of the Assyrian Empire. The most famous of these winged figures come from the palace of the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II, whose reign began around 883 BCE. Row after row of these carved guardians line the palace walls, each one holding the bucket in one hand and the cone in the other, reaching toward the sacred tree in what looks like a ceremonial gesture. Archaeologists and art historians have a name for this, the bucket and cone motif, and it shows up constantly throughout Assyrian palace art, especially from around the 9th to 7th centuries BCE, though similar imagery appears earlier too, in Sumerian and Babylonian art going back even further. So who are these winged figures, and what exactly are they doing? Mesopotamian texts call many of them Apkallu, a word that essentially means wise ones or sages. In the mythology, the Apkallu were semi-divine beings credited with teaching early humanity the foundations of civilization, writing, law, agriculture, architecture, and ritual knowledge. Some ancient sources describe 7 of these sage figures in particular, each associated with a specific era or a specific king they were said to have advised. The tradition treats them with the kind of careful, structured detail ancient scribes usually reserve for real historical records, listing names, associated rulers, and specific teachings, which is part of why this mythology has always felt unusually vivid and specific compared to more loosely told legends. This is where a particular strand of alternative history writing takes over the story, most famously associated with authors like Zechariah Sitchin and later popularized by figures like Graham Hancock. Sitchin, whose work has been consistently and thoroughly rejected by professional Sumerologists, Assyriologists, and historians, built an entire mythology around the idea that Mesopotamian gods, called the Anunnaki, were actually extraterrestrial visitors from a supposed undiscovered planet, and that objects like this bag represented advanced alien technology carried by these beings as they taught early humans the basics of civilization. This idea has sold an enormous number of books and continues to circulate widely across documentaries and online videos, but it has never been accepted by the academic community studying these cultures, and mainstream scholars are blunt about why. There is no linguistic, archaeological, or textual evidence supporting the extraterrestrial interpretation, and the actual cuneiform texts describing these objects describe mundane ritual buckets, not technological devices. More importantly, when specialists have actually compared the Mesopotamian, Göbekli Tepe, and Mesoamerican examples side by side in real detail, rather than just glancing at silhouettes that look similar from a distance, the case for them being literally the same object falls apart. Archaeologist and iconography specialist Andrea Sinclair, who has studied late Bronze Age Near Eastern and Egyptian imagery in depth, has directly addressed the viral handbag comparisons and concluded plainly that these are, in her words, completely different objects. The Assyrian bucket is a two-dimensional, side-on depiction of a rounded container with a handle, shown the way Mesopotamian artists conventionally rendered three-dimensional objects in profile. The objects held by Mesoamerican figures and the shapes carved at Göbekli Tepe come from entirely separate artistic traditions, separate religious contexts, and separate purposes, and specialists in those specific fields generally interpret them completely differently, tied to their own local ritual and symbolic systems, rather than to Mesopotamian tree worship or purification ceremonies. This actually points to something more interesting than a single lost global secret, and it is a pattern well recognized across the study of ancient art worldwide. Human beings, working independently in different parts of the world, repeatedly arrive at broadly similar shapes for broadly similar purposes, because there are only so many practical, comfortable ways to draw a container with a handle or a figure holding something down at their side. A rectangle with a slightly curved handle on top is, frankly, close to the simplest possible way to depict a bucket or a small bag in profile using the artistic conventions of the ancient world. Archaeologists call this convergent design, the same basic visual solution appearing again and again across unrelated cultures, not because of contact or shared origin, but because human visual thinking tends to solve similar problems in similar ways. The same way ancient cultures scattered across the world independently invented pottery, agriculture, and pyramid-shaped monuments without ever meeting each other. None of this means the underlying Mesopotamian material is boring, because it genuinely is not. The Apkallu tradition and the bucket and cone motif represent one of the richest, most consistently documented threads of religious symbolism from the ancient Near East, stretching from early Sumerian art through the height of the Assyrian Empire, a span of well over 1,000 years. That kind of consistency within a single connected cultural tradition, from Sumer through Assyria, genuinely is remarkable and worth studying closely, because it shows just how deeply rooted certain religious and agricultural rituals were in Mesopotamian society across an enormous span of time. Scholars specializing in this material have spent careers tracing exactly how the imagery evolved, which specific dynasties and temples favored it, and how it connects to the broader Mesopotamian obsession with sacred trees, fertility, and divine blessing. There's also a broader lesson in why claims like the ancient astronaut interpretation of this object spread so easily and persist so stubbornly online, even decades after specialists thoroughly addressed them. Vague, low-resolution comparisons are extremely persuasive at a glance. A handful of carved shapes shown side by side without careful attention to their actual archaeological context, their original size, their material, their specific cultural meaning, or the actual words ancient people used to describe them can look startlingly similar in a short video or a viral image post. But the moment specialists bring in the actual textual evidence, the actual physical bucket artifacts recovered from Mesopotamian sites, and detailed side-by-side comparisons of the carving techniques and conventions used in each separate tradition, the differences become clear rather quickly. This is not a case of academics stubbornly refusing to look at inconvenient evidence. It is closer to the opposite, a case where the sensational interpretation depends on not looking too closely, because closer inspection consistently favors the more grounded explanation. It is also worth noting that historians studying the spread of ancient astronaut theories more broadly have raised a separate, important concern that deserves mention here too. Several scholars have pointed out that this entire genre of alternative history, the idea that early human civilizations were too advanced to have built or discovered things on their own and needed outside intervention from more advanced visitors, has often carried an implicit and troubling undertone, subtly downplaying the genuine ingenuity of ancient societies, including the very real, well-documented achievements of the Sumerians, the builders of Göbekli Tepe, and the Olmec and Maya civilizations of Mesoamerica. Every one of these cultures accomplished things that stand entirely on their own merit, without needing an outside explanation to make them impressive. The Sumerians really did invent writing independently. The people who built Göbekli Tepe really did construct massive stone monuments using nothing but Stone Age tools, thousands of years before agriculture existed anywhere on Earth. The Olmec really did develop sophisticated art, architecture, and possibly an early writing system independently in Mesoamerica. None of these achievements require a shared ancient technology or a mysterious outside teacher to be worth marveling at. It is also worth briefly addressing the underlying concept many of these alternative theories lean on, something Sumerian texts do actually describe, called the me, sometimes translated roughly as divine decrees or divine powers. In Mesopotamian mythology, the me were treated almost like abstract cultural properties, covering things like kingship, priesthood, law, music, and craftsmanship, and stories describe them being held, transferred, and even stolen between gods and cities, as though civilization itself could be handed over like a set of possessions. Some popular writers have leaned heavily on this concept, suggesting the me represented something like ancient data storage devices or advanced technology, and linking that idea directly to the bucket carried by the Apkallu. But this interpretation goes well beyond what the actual cuneiform texts describe. The me are consistently portrayed in Mesopotamian literature as abstract divine attributes and social institutions, the concept of kingship itself, the concept of law itself, not physical machines, and no surviving Mesopotamian text ever equates the me directly with the ritual bucket carried in these carvings. Treating a poetic, abstract concept from Sumerian religious literature as though it describes literal ancient technology is a significant interpretive leap, one that mainstream Assyriologists and Sumerologists do not support based on the actual texts as they were written. So where does that leave the object itself? The most well-supported, evidence-based answer is straightforward. In Mesopotamian art specifically, the bucket and cone carried by the Apkallu figures represents a real ritual water vessel and a sprinkling implement tied to ceremonies of blessing, purification, and the symbolic care of the sacred tree, a tradition documented across more than 1,000 years of Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian religious art, and confirmed both by surviving cuneiform texts naming the object and by actual metal buckets recovered by archaeologists that match the shape shown in the carvings. The visually similar shapes found at Göbekli Tepe and in Mesoamerican art almost certainly represent separate, independently developed objects and symbols from entirely different cultural traditions, resembling the Mesopotamian bucket only because there are a limited number of simple, practical ways to carve a handled container and profile using the artistic techniques available at the time. None of this makes the topic any less worth exploring. It just means the real mystery here is not a hidden global conspiracy or advanced alien technology quietly waiting to be uncovered. The real mystery, the one actual historians and archaeologists spend their careers chasing, is the much richer and more human question of how religious ideas about sacred trees, divine wisdom, and ritual purification took hold so deeply in Mesopotamian society and stayed remarkably consistent for well over 1,000 years of art, ritual, and belief across the rise and fall of multiple empires in that same river valley. So the next time you see a video claiming scientists just uncovered a shocking, unexplainable connection between ancient handbags carved on opposite sides of the planet, it is worth remembering what actually sits underneath that claim. A well-documented Mesopotamian ritual object with a known name, a known function, and physical examples sitting in museum collections today, alongside a handful of separately invented, visually similar shapes from cultures that never had any contact with Mesopotamia at all. The truth here is not that history is hiding something enormous from us. It is that human beings, working independently across thousands of years and thousands of miles, kept arriving at strikingly similar, simple solutions to the basic problem of how to draw a container in your hand, and that a good story about lost secrets tends to spread a lot faster online than a careful explanation about ancient ritual buckets ever will. There's one final point worth sitting with, because it says something honest about how this whole genre of ancient mystery content tends to work. The most viral versions of the handbag story almost always show you the carvings side by side, cropped tightly, stripped of scale, material, and context, and let the visual similarity do all the persuading. What they rarely show you is the surrounding relief, the full scene the figure is standing in, the specific cuneiform inscriptions labeling the ritual or the actual recovered bronze and copper buckets sitting in museum storage that match the Mesopotamian carvings, almost exactly in shape and size. Once you put all of that context back in, the mystery does not disappear entirely, but it shrinks down from a planet-spanning secret into something much more grounded, a genuinely interesting case study in how separate cultures, working independently, sometimes land on strikingly similar visual solutions to entirely different problems. If you found this breakdown interesting, let me know in the comments which ancient mystery you want properly fact-checked next, and subscribe if you want more videos that separate the genuinely fascinating history from the claims built on top of it.